I lied to you last week. We're going to continue our series. You're like, some girl in the front was like, oh. We're going to continue our series called Space Between Us. I thought we were done, and sometimes, when you think you're done, the Lord says you're not done, and so here we are again. We're not going to be in the book of Genesis today, but I want to share a story with you that as I was reading it this week, I just became convinced and encouraged that it's quite possible that this area of our lives is one of the greatest blocks in our relationships. It's one of the things that I believe is having one of the greatest impacts on our marriages and our relationships with our kids and with our coworkers and friendships. And as we dive into this, I want to address the idea of what God wants to do with our mental health. And I started reading a passage in Scripture about a man named Elijah. And I'm going to share with you this morning of a guy named Elijah. We're jumping out of the Garden of Eden. I just thought, we need to stay here for just a moment. And sometimes when God's doing something, you just stay right there in that moment until you feel like He's done, and then you can move on. And one of those things for me was as I began praying about our relationships and our marriages, I began realizing that sometimes in my own life, the thing that stands between me and my spouse the most are my own thoughts. Sometimes the thing that causes the most chaos inside of my home is my own mental energies and my own mental thoughts and what's happening. And so I want to talk to us on that idea this morning. I was reminded this week of a story. I used to ride dirt bikes growing up. And I was I had gotten big enough. I was too big for the smaller bike, and it wasn't fast enough. And so I got the bigger bike, and the only problem was I couldn't touch the ground. But who needs to touch the ground if you're going, right? And so I remember learning to ride this bike. You'd have to run, and you just have to jump on and hope you didn't fall off. And if you stopped, you got to jump off, right? No big deal. It's kind of like being a Christian, You're either moving forward or you're falling off. And sometimes what I realize is if we're not being proactive in the area of our mental health, that what can happen is we can feel like we're falling off. What can happen is if we're not being proactive and inviting God into our thoughts and our anxieties and our fears and our concerns and our depressions and our attacks that come our way, if we're not inviting God into it, because of the current and the ways of the world, you're either moving forward or you're going backwards. You're either riding forward or you're falling off. I'll never forget that bike was so big the first time I took it to a dirt bike racetrack that was way out of my league. I went with a bunch of older kids and I thought I'll just keep up. And I'll never forget the first lap around that track, there was this thing called a double ramp. And I was just trying not to ramp at all. I was just trying to hold on for dear life and not fall off this thing. And I'll never forget I went off a ramp and I didn't realize that you didn't really have a choice. You got to fly. You go off it and it kind of cliffs off the other side, which was great except for the fact that there was another ramp behind it. It's called a double ramp. In other words, you're supposed to jump off the first one, not die, and clear the second one. Well, I didn't clear the second one, that's for sure, because I barely cleared the first one. I'll never forget, I went over the top front of my handlebars. I landed on my shoulder, and I broke my arm right here. I knew it. I could feel it. I remember holding my arm and walking off the track, and my dad took me to the emergency room. My mom called on the way. He didn't tell her, that's for sure. I went to the hospital, and it wasn't just a cast. It was a junior high boy's worst nightmare. It was a cast that wraps around your whole stomach and holds your arm right here for the next 6 months. And I remember the effects that it had on my life, right? I remember the feeling. I remember junior high was bad enough. Add that to the mix. So I'm clearly still working through a lot of my mental challenges. And I remember after the cast came off thinking my life is going to go back to the way it was, that things will be normal again. Until I went to the junior high guys' weight room. And I went to lift the very first time and remember the weight of the bar going like this. And I remember thinking, every dude in this room is watching me right now. And I remember trying to lift the bar and realizing I had strength in one arm but not the other. Sometimes in life we can get strong in one area, and we're often overcome or overwhelmed by the fact that there's not strength in every area. And as I began to do that, I realized the physical effects that happened to me. I went to camp that summer with all my friends, thinking my cast is off, life will be good now. And I remember trying to do the challenges, and they had this out in the middle of the lake. They had this big ice igloo thing that you're supposed to climb to the top and play King of the Hill. I remember trying to one-handed climb up the thing. I have these memories etched in my mind, remembering the feeling of my arm not being back to full strength and full shape. As we talk this morning, I want to encourage you, because the reality is we understand how physical things can limit our life. And not only do we understand it, we can see it in other people. If somebody's going through something physically, you can often see it. They're hunched over, or they're in pain, or they can't walk the way they had before, or they have a cast, and you can often see the impacts of the physical. But it's the mental that likes to pretend like it's unseen, at least until it becomes seen. You see, it's the mental challenges that we go through in the quiet and the secret of our home that stay in the quiet and secret of our home until one day they overflow into the public places of our life. It's the mental things that we are challenged with, and the anxieties and the fears and the depression and the discouragement and maybe the self-harming or suicidal thoughts that happen in the secret of our own home. And the burden that I was placed on with this week is the idea that it's those things that often bear the greatest weight on our relationships. Because it's not just us going through them, it's the people that are closest who are carrying that weight with us. As we talk about it this morning, I realize there's people in all different kinds of camps today. And my heart and my hope is that as you walk out of here, you walk out of here with your heart being lightened, your load being lifted. Because what happens is when you get in the presence of God, He can do some things to help you along the way. It doesn't have to be that thing that you struggle with and no one else knows about. It doesn't have to be the thing that overcomes you and becomes labeled as your life, as this is who I am, this is all I'll ever be, this will never leave me. And as we talk about this, I realize there are people in the room today who are going through some mental health challenges of some kind. Maybe fear set into your life. And every time something good happens, you're always waiting for something bad to happen. Maybe it's the anxiety, a social anxiety, or an anxiety about your future. Maybe you've gone through job transitions lately, and the overwhelming fear and anxiety that creeps on your life that all of a sudden came out because it was triggered by something in your life. Those things are real. And those things have real effects on our relationships. So maybe for you today, you're currently walking through something, or maybe for you, you've never struggled with any of these areas in your whole life until something happened. I was like, overnight, anxiety set in, and you don't even know what to do. You're like, I've never struggled with this in my whole life. I've been walking with God for 40 years, and I never struggled with this, and all of a sudden it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I talk to people all the time who are going through the same thing that you're talking about. This idea that I was fine until I wasn't, and it was okay until it wasn't, and here we are. Maybe for you, you're not dealing with mental challenges on your own. Maybe for you, you have somebody closest to you who's carrying that weight and that burden. And often the challenge in a marriage or a relationship can be feeling powerless to help the other person. What do I do? If I don't feel what they feel or understand their life the way that they're understanding it, how can I be best of service to the person that I love the most? Maybe you're not going through challenges of your own, but maybe you're walking alongside someone who is. And I believe that the Word of God speaks to all of these things. And just the heartbeat that I got this week was I started thinking about Jesus. Jesus walked up to all of these people who were going through physical challenges. He walked up to the blind. He walked up to a lady who had an issue of blood for 12 years. And you know what? He looks at her and he says, "Woman, your faith has made you well. Get up and walk." There's a word in the Bible that we often use in church. It's called being saved. We talk about being saved all the time, but sometimes I don't think we realize the magnitude of that word in its original language. We think about being saved. I gave my life to Jesus. I'm going to heaven one day. My eternity is secure with God. But often what we don't realize is that word saved has everything to do with being made whole. Another translation to the word saved is to be made whole. When Jesus walks up to a person who is struggling with a physical challenge and tells them, He says, "Go and be made whole." In other words, to me, as I read that, I'm encouraged to know that God cares about every part of your life. He doesn't just care about you going to heaven one day. He cares about how you feel today. He cares about what you're walking in today. He cares about the challenges in your marriage. He cares about your family. And I know, we're at church, we believe this stuff, but do we really believe it? It's like when Jesus walks up to someone and says, do you want to be made well? It's like, well, of course they wouldn't. Why wouldn't they want to be made well? Sometimes I think we say we believe it. We give it a mental thought. But deep down in our soul and our gut, what I've found from time to time is I'll say it with my mouth, but I don't necessarily believe it in here. And my hope and my heart for you is this, that you would know above all else that God wants to help you be whole in every area of your life. And just like that bar that discouraged me from ever going to the weight room again, that eventually, over time, with God's help, you can do the things you once did before. That actually with God's help, you can actually do, as Ephesians 3 says, immeasurably more than all you could have ever thought, asked, or imagined. That with God's help, you can gain strength in this area. So I want to tell you about a man in the Bible. His name is Elijah. Maybe you've heard of Elijah. Maybe you've heard of Elisha. We're talking about Elijah today with a J. And Elijah was known as a man who loved God. He was a prophet. He did the things of God. And I want you to know this. Think about that Christian in your life that you're like, man, I just hope one day I could be like them. You got that Christian that you're like, man, they just seem to have it all figured out. Their life seems together. Like, this was that guy. This was the guy who was walking around doing supernatural things that by any standards today, if we had witnessed this and watched this, we would be left in awe. Elijah goes around, he parted the Jordan River. Elijah goes and he calls down rain from heaven in his prayers, and it starts raining in the middle of a drought and dried up time. Elijah's the guy who stood before the king, said, you're defying God. And he calls down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice offering out on the altar in front of 450 prophets of Baal, and 400 other prophets are all standing there against God. Elijah, one man, stands before them and says, watch what my God can do. I mean, this guy had faith. This guy is the guy who brought his Bible to church. This is the guy who had the answers in Sunday school class. This guy had it going on. He was known as a man after God's own heart, or known as a man of God in such a way that even when the prophets of Baal came against him, he went and killed all of them in the name of God. He was powerful in everything that he did. In fact, he's referenced in the New Testament long after he died. He's referenced over 29 times by name. Outside of that, he's even referenced, and we know they're speaking of the spirit of Elijah. In fact, so much so that when John comes on the scene, John the Baptist, to prepare the way for Jesus, people are like, is that guy Elijah? When Jesus comes and Jesus asks the disciples, who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist, they said, and others say Elijah. And Jesus himself says it's the spirit of Elijah that's happened in this way. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is this guy was a man of God. He had things figured out. And yet it's his story that gives us the greatest insight and the greatest biblical answers to the challenges of mental health. Why? Because even the strongest have their weak moments. Even the people who feel like they have it all figured out have moments of weakness where they're saying, God, I don't know what to do. I don't know how I got here, and I don't know how I'm getting out of here. And Elijah, the man of God, found himself sitting down in the middle of the wilderness, praying to God that God would take his life because he was done. He was ready to quit. He was ready to throw in the towel. So much so that he isolated himself in the wilderness and found himself going through a lot of the challenges that we hear talked about in our world today. Anxiety, fear, loss of confidence, suicidal, self-harming thoughts. All of these challenges the man of God faced. 1 Kings chapter 19. It's a little bit of a long story, so bear with me this morning, but I want you to have the full context of what's happening here. Ahab told Jezebel, Ahab was the king. Jezebel was a not nice lady. All that Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life like one of the lives of the many of them by this time tomorrow. Jezebel's threatening him. You killed the prophets, and if by this time tomorrow you're not dead, then let me be dead. In other words, I'm coming after you. With the full force of the king, I am coming after you, Elijah. Verse 3, the man of God, the guy who just killed 450 prophets of Baal, the guy who watched God answer his prayers and fire come down from heaven, the guy who parted the Jordan, ran in fear. He was afraid, and he arose, and he ran for his life, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey farther into the wilderness alone. And he came and he sat down under a broom tree, and he asked God that he might die, saying, "Is it enough now, Lord? Take away my life, for I'm no better than my fathers." And he lay down and he slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat. Get up and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. Wouldn't it be nice when you're having a bad day if you just woke up and God's like, "Here's a hot cake," you know? And he ate and he drank and he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, get up, for the journey is too great for you." You ever felt like the journey is too great? And he arose and he ate and he drank, and he went in the strength of the food that God gave him for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the mount of God. Verse 9, there he came to a cave and he lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel. They've forsaken your covenant." This is the part of our prayers where we're blaming everybody else, right? A little bit angry, a little bit bitter, a little bit afraid. They've thrown down your altars and they've killed the prophets with the sword. I'm the only one left, and they seek my life to take it away. And God said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. All these big signs, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and he stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, yet again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" I love this story. I love this story. You've probably heard the passage about God not being in the wind and in the fire, but in the still small whisper. I believe that's because our God is so good, he knows exactly what we need when we need it. He knows the things that we need even when we don't know what we need. And in the middle of his despair and in the midst of his depression and his discouragement, God didn't come to him with another loud sign of the fire coming down from heaven. God did not come to him in the form of another 450 prophets showing up and God miraculously moving. God didn't come to him the way that he had come to him in the past. God came to him in the way that he needed him in the moment. And what he needed in the moment of despair and loneliness and grief and depression and suicidal attack was to hear the whisper of a father who loved him. Not a condemning voice. "Elijah, what are you doing here? I can't believe," not like we talk to our kids. "What are you doing in there?" But God came to him, I believe, saying, "Elijah, what are you doing here?" It's almost like God is asking, "Elijah, what do you need? Elijah, in this moment of your dark moment of your life, what do you need?" Because here's what had happened with Elijah. Elijah was used to running in the power of God. He saw the fire. He saw the wind. He saw God do supernatural things. And so long as he was running in the power of God, things tended to be some of his best days of ministry. We read about him thousands of years later. We're reading about a guy who, when he knew how to run in the power of God, things worked for him in a very powerful way. In fact, so much so that after the whole incident of God calling down fire on the sacrifice, it says that Elijah looked at King Ahab and said, "You better watch out, the rain is coming." And it says that Elijah took his tunic, in other words, his man dress that they wore back in the day, and he tucked it inside of his belt. He told the king, you better get back to where you were going. And the king mounted up on his chariot and his horse. And for 25 miles, Elijah outran a horse and chariot of the king. The fastest horse, the best horse. Elijah outran him. The Bible illustrates the idea that he was divinely empowered. In other words, he wasn't just Clayton Small running a marathon, because we all know that wouldn't do nothing. But for 25 miles, he had the divine empowerment of God on his life to run supernatural pace. And sometimes I think about that in my life, and I think, man, if only I had a spiritual strength to run a race that I don't have the own strength to run. You see, Elijah was used to running in the power of God, but something happened. When he stopped running in the power of God, he started running in the power of fear. And the same man who had just outrun the king and his chariots is now being threatened, and instead of running in the power of God, he runs to the wilderness to be alone. And instead of running straight into the things that God had for him, he started running in the other direction. And when he did, things got worse for him. He became suicidal. He was afraid. He experienced intense loneliness because he was running in the power of fear. And I want to propose to you out of Hebrews 10 this morning that Elijah had positioned himself to run the race. We all have a race to run. But he hadn't positioned himself to persevere in the race. In other words, it's one thing to get up and run a sprint. It's another to run a marathon and keep going. Listen to what it says in Hebrews chapter 10. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. I think sometimes as we talk about these challenges that face our own personal soul, but also the soul of our marriage, it has an impact on. I think we need to remember that the Lord is saying it's time to persevere. It's time to get up and keep going. And at the risk of sounding insensitive to what someone might be going through, I want you to hear the tone of God when he tells Elijah, get up and go. That he doesn't tell him to do it on his own strength. In other words, he's reflecting back or hearkening back to the moment when Elijah was running in the power of God and saying, with God's help, you can make it out of this. With God's strength, you will have everything that you need. But there's some things I think we need to put into place. The first one this morning is this: don't do life alone. If you're facing challenges in your life, it's more important than ever. Do not do life alone. Listen to where Elijah went. He went to a place called Beersheba. It's not the land of beer. He was not running excitement about what he would enjoy out there with all of his buddies. He was running to the wilderness. Someone who runs to the wilderness is running to a place of isolation. And what that tells me is often when we're struggling with our thoughts and anxiety and fear and setback in life, our greatest threat is, and the greatest thing that the enemy would want us to do is go to the place where we're all alone. And in the place of being all alone in isolation, have you ever thought, man, I just feel so much better. Now, there's a difference. You had a long week. You need some me time, some personal space. We're not talking about this. We're talking about Elijah left his servant behind and went a day's journey of walking into the wilderness to be alone. You know what the isolation does in our life? It lies to us. Because here's what Elijah began to believe. Elijah began to believe, I'm all alone. Nobody feels what I feel, and nobody's following God anymore. That's not true. God goes on in the next chapter, and he says, I've reserved back over 700 people of God that have not bowed their knee to any other God. Elijah, you're not alone. But the place of isolation wants us to think and wants us to believe the lie that we are the only one here and no one can understand me and no one can help me. Can I tell you that's the greatest lie? You're not all alone. Listen to what it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9. You've probably heard this before. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. But if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. You know what you need? You need godly people in your life. So that when you go through your weak moments, your hard moments, when your marriage is on the brink of just challenges, that you have other outside voices and influences that come and speak into your life. This isn't just about being a Christian club and having friends because it seems like the cool thing to do. This is about saving our souls. This is about becoming as whole as God intended for us to become. This is about us not just lifting the bar great in one area, but about lifting the bar full in strength in every area that God has called us to. It kind of reminds me of this. There's this idea in counseling, and I've used this a couple of times, but often what happens is as we face mental challenges, it feels like a cloud over our head. You've heard people describe it that way. It's like the fog that we saw this morning. It sets in. And the problem with the fog or the cloud that's over our head, whether it's fear or anxiety, is it keeps us from seeing the light that we need to see. And the issue is not in acknowledging that. The issue is often the fact that we don't know what to do about the cloud. How do we get it off of us? Like, how can we see clearly again? You may think, oh man, some of my feelings, I know they're irrational, but I just don't know how to get the cloud to lift. It's like it shows up every day. One of the things about not doing life alone and making that commitment is this. Actually, I didn't tell you I was going to. Would you come up here for just a second? Your whole person. No, I don't need it. Come up here. What happens is this. If I'm feeling a cloud, thank you, Vanna. Come on. Yeah. If there's a cloud over my head, the problem is I can't see the light and the sun. But she's not going through what I'm going through. So you know who can see it? She can. So until the cloud moves, I'm looking to her. Because she has an accurate representation of what the light looks like. She can see things that I can't see. And eventually what happens is, as she reflects his light to me, I get light in some dark areas of my life. And as I get light, what does light do to the fog? It begins to part it. It begins to move off. And what happens is she became the source of light that I needed help seeing in the moments when I couldn't see it by myself. She's not the light. Trust me, I'm married. We're married. We know. But I will tell you this, she can see the light with a clarity. Thank you. You can have a seat. I'll tell you next time I do something like that. Well, all I'm trying to say is this. Put people in your life. This is a shameless plug. Join a group. Why? Because it's full of people who want to follow God, who are not perfect, who make your life feel not so alone because maybe they've been through some of the things that you've been through. And they can see the light in a way that maybe you haven't yet seen the light. And they can show you something that you haven't seen before. I'm going to confession for you. I see a counselor once a month. I go to a life coach who can tell me things that I can't see about myself. Why? I'm a pastor, so I spend most of my week telling people how they should live their life. And I figure if I'm going to spend my time telling people how they should live their life, then I should have somebody in my life who tells me how I should live my life. Why? Because if I can't submit to do that myself, then why in the world would anybody want to listen to what I have to say? And so why do I do that? I do that because he can see things I can't. I'll just, full transparency here. You know what he told me last week? He said, Clayton, you're trying to parent your kids on the weekend thinking that's going to get them all the way through the week. What are you doing to parent your kids during the week? And I was like, ouch. He's like, you need to rearrange your schedule. Your schedule's not working. You don't have enough margin. You're working too much. You're doing these. You need to rearrange your schedule. What am I doing? I'm letting, it hurt, it stung, but I'm letting him be light to me. Why? Because it will make me whole. Don't do life alone. Elijah believed the lie, and he found himself alone. I got to speed up. We got to get going. All right? Number 2, get up. Get up. I was never good at sports. The reason I was never good at sports is because I quit every sport I ever did. That's not where you thought I was going. It's not that I didn't get an athletic gene or break my arm in junior high that ruined my sports career. I got good at quitting. And when I got good at quitting, it means I got good at not trying anymore. And I think the lie that we can believe in our mental health is that I'm down and I can't get up. And what Elijah experiences is Elijah goes and he sits under a tree and he sits down and God tells him to get up. He goes and he sits down and he thinks this is the end of the road for him. It doesn't matter all the great things that God did for me, I'm done. And I love that our world and our culture today is talking about mental health in a way that they never have before. I think it's a great thing. The challenge or concern that I have as a pastor is that the proposition of our world is they talk about mental health as if it now becomes the identity that we wear. It's one thing to struggle with something, it's another to sit with it. It's one thing to go through something, it's another to believe that that's your fate in life. It's one thing to go through something and think, everyone else deals with it, I guess it's just a lot in life that I have. And what can happen is we turn our mental health into an identity instead of a struggle. We turn our mental health into the end game, the destination, instead of a journey. And what I believe God was graciously and tenderly doing to Elijah, as he sat down in the wilderness alone under the tree, he began to label his identity and put it all over him. And listen to what God did. God said, in love, get up. Get up. You have to keep going. Get up. This isn't the end. Get up. I know you want to quit, but I'm not done with you yet. Get up. It's not good yet, so God's not done yet. And what Elijah did in that moment was, you got to listen to this. He got up and he went to a place called Mount Horeb. Means nothing to us, except for that this little identifier it says right behind it. It's called the Mount of God. This is the same mountain. It's 200 miles away from where he was, which means, guess what? Elijah had to walk, skip, or run again. And God tells him to get up. And by the way, here's the food and the strength that you're going to need to make it there. In his love, in his mercy, in his compassion, in his grace, he gives Elijah the strength that he needs to make it to his destination. And Elijah stands up, and I don't know if he walked or he ran that day, but he went a 40 days journey through the wilderness. It might have taken him some time. He might have done a few circles while he was out there. He might have tried to turn around and go back for a day and decide, I can't do that. And he went, and you know where he went? He went to Mount Horeb, 200 miles away. Why? Mount Horeb was the place where God spoke to Moses to lead the people of Israel. It's the place where Moses had an encounter with the presence of God, and everything changed for God's people. What I believe is as Elijah's walking in the wilderness alone, hearing the voice of God that gave him a word to say, get up and keep going, you're going to make it. He walks up to the mountain of God, and he stands in the presence of God. It says that he lodged in a cave. In other words, he made himself a home in the very presence of God, and it was there that God spoke to him. If you're dealing with something, if you're going through something, can I tell you the greatest thing you could do is get yourself into the presence of God. Get up and get in the presence of God, even if you don't feel like it. Even if you're afraid it's not going to work, and what if you're the only one in all of human race that it's not going to work on? Because that's what the mental challenges going on inside of our mind would tell us. Maybe it'll work for those other church people, but not you. And Elijah had to battle all those enemies in his mind, and he did it to get to the one place that could change his destiny. And he stood before the Lord, and we don't know much about what happened. Next week I'm going to talk about purpose. God gave Elijah a purpose in the middle of his pain. And in that purpose, can I tell you what happened? We never read the story of Elijah's struggles again. All we read about are his victories, his strengths, and one moment of weakness. Can I tell you what had to have happened for Elijah? At some point along that journey, when God came to him, God said, Elijah, why are you here? And Elijah said, you know what? I'm all alone. There's no one else. I'm all alone in this. And God says, Elijah, why are you here? And I believe he began to lay all these things down on the mountain of God. What does it say? It says that he got in the presence of God, and God asked him a question, and God listened, and listened to what began to happen. He got a word from the Lord as a whisper. The thing that you need more than anything else, find friends, find godly counsel, see a counselor, listen to your spouse who can see the light even when you can't. But above all else, do whatever it takes to get in the presence of God. Because listen to what happened to Elijah. When he got into the presence of God, he gained the perspective of God. He could see his challenges in a different light. I'm not saying it goes away and you never battle it again. I'm saying that with God's perspective and God's light on the situation, we read about him today as a man of God. And he made it through because he refused to wear those badges on his life as an identity. Can I tell you, if nobody's ever told you, you're not the things that you've done, you're not the things that have happened to you. You may struggle with depression, but you're not depressed forever. You may have anxiety creep into your life, but can I tell you, don't walk around your house saying, I'm just an anxious person. Why? Because if God doesn't put that label on you, don't you ever dare put that label on you. Listen to what it says in Psalm 23. I want to read this to you today, and we're going to close out here in this moment. Psalm 23. God's helping me. Listen to this. I just want to read it over you. The Lord is my shepherd, and then we'll close out in prayer. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk, listen, Elijah, through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your presence with me changes everything. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me in my moments of weakness, in my moments of despair. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Here it is again. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's for you.